Let's cover some of the HTML basics. Inside our HTML file, let's talk about the individual pieces so you can make sense of each of the elements of a basic HTML page. This first piece is called the doc type, and this doc type specifies to the browser how to render it. There have been different versions of HTML over the years, HTML 1, 2, 3, 301, 4, etc. We're currently working with HTML5, and this doc type tells the browser what version of HTML you're using. Some of the older doc types were very long and cumbersome, but there was the decision in HTML5 to make it as simple as the doc type is just HTML. That means it's an HTML5 document, and it will be treated like it is. The first object you'll find is the HTML object. This is the container for everything on your page. So it normally starts and ends each of the documents you're dealing with. The first child inside the HTML element is normally this section called head. And head is where non-structural information is kept. You can think of this as maybe a metadata structure. So one of the first things that almost every page gets is a title. And so I'll just call the title of our page the world for now. Another piece of information pretty much every page should have is what it was encoded with. And so we'll use a tag called meta and set a property in it called charset. And this is the character set that the page is using. UTF-8 is primarily what you should be using for all your web pages. This is just to tell the browsers this is what we think we're sending you, and ordinarily that would be right. That allows for localization and other things to be set up with this main character set. If we run this in the browser or view it again in the browser, you can see we're still getting that HTML page, but here in the tab, it is now saying the world. This is where the title ends up in the UI. That title is something that browsers will treat in different ways. And in fact, as you make a new bookmark, that bookmark is also going to derive its name from the title. The next section, and the section you're going to be dealing with primarily, is something called the body. The body is the descriptive structure of what your page is. And right now we don't have a whole lot of structure. We have these H2 object, and an H2 is a header. HTML was originally created to create documents. So a lot of this will look like the sort of tags and pieces that you might imagine in a Word document or some other structural text document. So H2 says use the header 2 level of text. And in fact, if we make this H1, we can see that Visual Studio fixes the beginning and ending for us, but also that in the browser, it's going to get a little bigger. And that is by design. H1 all the way down to H6 are going to look like headings, but get smaller and less bold as they go down from 1 to 6. The P tag, which we also have here, is called the paragraph tag, and this is just for paragraph level text. So anything that's put inside of a paragraph will be listed as simple blocks of text. Let's create some structure here. I'm going to do this by selecting both the lines and hitting Shift-Alt-W. Now this Shift-Alt-W experience is something that came from the Web Essentials extension that I talked about installing into Visual Studio in the first module. But in either case, we're simply surrounding those pieces of text we have in this thing called a div. And a div is a structure for some part of the page. You're going to see that lots of your page are going to be made up of this container called a div. And a div can contain not only elements, but elements of elements and elements of elements. And so what we're doing here is we want to create two sections of the page. The main section of the page that has our content, which is going to right now only be these 2 lines of content, but also another div that's going to contain our footer. So of course this is after the first div, so it's going to show up afterwards. HTML is drawn top down, outermost to innermost. So because this div is lower than this div, it's going to come after it on the page. So here in this div, let's start with something called an entity. In HTML, there's a number of these shortcuts for displaying certain kinds of characters. And in other languages, these may be called escaping a character, but they're called entities in HTML. And the first one that you often run into is the copyright symbol. All of these start with an ampersand and then have a set of characters after them and ends with a semicolon. And you can see a number of these Visual Studio wants to help us with. So I'm just going to say copy, and this will turn into a copyright symbol on our page, which we'll see in a second. And I'll make up a company to own the copyright for our particular page. Let's see this in the browser. And so we now have that copyright symbol because we're using an entity in the HTML page to say this is what we want you to render, and then the plain text. Now we're calling this the main part of the page and then the footer, but currently the footer is just being shown directly after all of the content. Later on in this module, we'll show you how you can get this to actually stick onto the bottom of a page, but we're not quite there yet.